Bagaimana mengatasi lingkungan dan pendidikan.
I know, I just
Tahu pelajaran
right, so we don't have to be the future the way we did that.
Ya, I hope so. That's the next Pak, nanti buat kita pakai mikrofon aja, nggak perlu kayak kemarin kan.
Iya, harus
pakai mikrofon.
Suaranya.
Oke, biar kedengeran ya.
Ya.
Oke. Sip. Berarti laptop yang satu lagi nggak usah.
Oh,
oke.
Nah, langsung itu
Ya.
masalah kemarinnya. Ya. Jadi kalau ada pertanyaan dari mereka harus pakai
Oke, berarti itu presentasi muncul di TV berarti ya? Oh ya, berarti nggak pakai fokus. Berarti semua di TV. Yuk.
So if people have questions, please
Yeah.
go right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Kita tahu sendiri ya, kalau hewan
Jadi kalau sudah yang ini saya bisa kalau ada yang itu berarti
dia tidak langsung dengan banyak yang lain dan
Yeah, then once again, I was taken for mulai dari desain dari kalau tadi yang karena jangan kalau sama kayak saya
hal yang kalau sekarang ini satu. Kalau misalnya tadi ada tempat yang bisa langsung misalnya kalau kan gerak saya mau jalan mungkin itu ya di kawasan ini semua spesies mengambil yang semua yang ancol mana yang bisa dibawa tidak memanfaatkan sebenarnya yang bisa dilakukan dari tidak mengurangi pengawasan ini kita mungkin masuk di hasil yang sendiri nih yang paling kalau kami tidak kepada ada matematika penjualan yang lain Iya.
Halo?
Pun kue.
Oh, ini udah masuk nih, Jo. Suara saya udah masuk. Tapi berarti nanti dari sana kedengeran nggak ya? Kedengeran. Oke. Jadi aku harus pakai mic ya. Ya, oke, sip.
Kalau yang ini dari sekolahnya, ini dari mana ada teman-teman dari tambahannya dari tujuannya
Oke, selamat siang semuanya. Mohon maaf saya harus memotong sesi diskusi yang lagi berlangsung super seru sekali. Pembicara kita selanjutnya sudah hadir bersama kita secara daring. Halo Juli. Okay. Hi, Jill. Do you hear me now? Hi. Okay. Bisa kedengaran semua? Okay, we can hear you from here. And thank you so much for willing to give a presentation today despite of your not really well condition. I'm really appreciate it. So let me introduce you a bit to all of the participants over here. So everyone, this is Dr. Joanna Sechel. She is the professor from the Department of Anthropology at Durham University from UK. And she's also the editor-in-chief of International Journal of Primatology and the president of Primat Society of Great Britain from 2018 to 2021. She co-edited a book on field and laboratory methods in primatology with an explicit focus on ethics, how to develop the International Primatological Society's code of best practices in field primatology, and also with the establishment of a new IPS vice president for equity and ethics. Her recent book, The Science Primates, that I hold right now. I'm a big fan of your book. It's a really good one. And it has a strong focus on equity, ethics, and integrity. So without any further ado, time is yours, June. And Susan will take over the decision. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation to present today. I hope I'm coming across well. When I hear you, there's a big echo. I'm going to share my screen now. Can you now see, oh, not my first slide. There we are. Can you now see my first slide?
Hi, Jill, Susan. Yes, we can. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So it's lovely to be there with you virtually. I hope one day that I can meet you all in person. And thank you for this invitation to talk about scientific publishing. I'm going to talk from an editorial perspective and tell you a little bit about what I think. But I have to note that what I think doesn't necessarily reflect what every editor thinks. And I also, my perspective is specifically from the UK. So when I talk a little bit, if I do, about scientific careers, that's from a UK perspective. I have a lot of colleagues and friends in France, in Germany, in Gabon, other parts of Central Africa. I have a small amount of experience in Malaysia, but none in Indonesia. So your situation may be quite different, and I'm very interested in hearing about it. So this is what you already know, that scientific writing and publication are challenging. When you sent me the brief for this talk, it included the results of a poll that said 94% of the people asked found scientific writing and publication challenging. So well done for the 6%. These are very common results. Scientific writing is hard. Publication is difficult. It's difficult and hard for everyone. Nobody automatically knows how to write a scientific paper. But of course, it's harder for people who don't. If you're writing in English, it's harder if it's not your first language. And of course, if you don't write English at all, it's hard. And so I have an enormous privilege through the luck of being born in a country where we speak English as our first language. I have attempted to write in French, so I have some idea of how difficult that is. So I think if you're at this workshop, you probably already know why we publish, but there are two main reasons and they can conflict. The first is that publication is an essential part of research and conservation. So anything that we do, if we go and we study primates and we find something out about those primates, whatever it is, an answer to a question that we had, unless we publish that, then no one else can know. So we can tell a few people and we can go to a conference and talk about it, but until it's written in the scientific record and published, then it isn't information that's out there for everybody to find. So it's an essential part of research, but it's one of the harder parts of research, and perhaps, depending on who you are, it's not the most fun. The other part of it is that we publish to sustain or further a career. And I'm not going to talk about that so much. I'm very happy to answer questions. But this is because publication has been hijacked or co-opted, really. And now we count the number of publications, or we use some metric about a paper to tell us how good the researcher is, when in fact we should be looking at other aspects of the researcher to find out how good they are, not quantity of papers or the journal they publish in. So what I was asked to do today, or I've summarized it here, was to tell you a little bit about what editors like me look for, talk a bit about choosing a journal, how you go about choosing a journal. I'll talk you through the publishing process, some of the things that go on behind the scenes and that you may or may not be familiar with. And then I'll talk about best practices, and I'll focus a lot on ethics towards the end. And then I'll add a few things that I picked out of the terms of reference that I thought I might be able to address too, if we have time at the end. So, as you know, I edit the International Journal of Primatology, and that's the official journal of the International Primatological Society. So it is our International Journal of Primatology. It's edited and written in English. And at the International Journal of Primatology, we aim to accept manuscripts. So I always say this because there are journals that are well regarded internationally that don't aim to accept. They give their editors targets for rejection. So some major journals have a target of rejecting 50% of the manuscripts they receive, regardless of the quality of the manuscript. It's not reject a manuscript for this or for that. It is simply that to keep their journal metrics high, they have to reject papers. Now, I don't work that way because I want to encourage international primatology, and the way to do that is to work with authors to make work acceptable if we can. That doesn't mean that we don't reject work, and I will tell you some of the reasons we reject work later on. But we do work with authors and with reviewers and with the other editors to accept if we can. And to do that, we provide very detailed guidance. We have instructions for authors, which are on our website and explain to authors how to write for the journal. We provide editorial guidance after submission. We ask our reviewers to be constructive, and the reviewers also have detailed guidance. And I mentioned this already, academic traditions vary and journals vary. So when I talk, I'm largely talking about the International Journal of Primatology. I also know other editors. I know Zimbo has presented to you who share this desire to publish and accept work if possible. And as I said, I'm a UK academic with experience of the USA quite a lot, because there are a lot of primatologists in the USA, France, Germany, and Gabon, much less of your part of the world. So publishing involves peer review, and peer review is much satirized. You hear a lot about evil reviewers, because when we submit a manuscript, we think that it is perfect and we don't want to consider the idea it might need to be improved. But peer review at its basis is designed to improve the quality of the manuscript under review and therefore the study that's eventually published. And I think we need to hold that in mind, because it can be a very bruising process, like getting feedback on student work. And I was dealing with a master's student yesterday who's just had comments from her examiners and is very angry about them. But we'll get to the place in the end where she'll realize that they are useful. So peer review is not perfect. It operates in various ways. But the consensus is that some form of peer review is better than no peer review, and it's the best system that we have at the moment. So what do editors look for in a manuscript? Well, the first thing they're looking for is relevance to the journal. So all journals have aims and scope. I'll show you the International Journal of Primatology aims and scope in a moment. So relevance to the journal, and that is whether it fits within what the journal is seeking to publish. So in the case of my journal, the IJP, we're looking for a contribution to our understanding of primates. And when I say a contribution to our understanding of primates, I mean something new. So something we didn't already know, which is why we call work original or novel. It doesn't mean that it has to be outstandingly new, because very little work is outstandingly new. It doesn't mean that we don't want replication. Replication is extremely important in science. So if one study has found something, we need to know that we can generalize and that we found again if we do the same sort of study elsewhere. We might want to find out if something that works in one species works in another species. But once we've amassed a lot of information about a topic, and here I often use the example of what chimpanzees eat, because there are very many studies of what chimpanzees eat. It is difficult now to make a study of what chimpanzees eat into a contribution to our understanding of primates, because we know very well what they eat. But what a new species of primate that we haven't yet studied eats, particularly if it's over perhaps a year, would be a contribution to our understanding of primates. So that's probably the hardest bit for a non-editor to understand. But of course, we all have colleagues and we can discuss these things with our colleagues. And then study design. So this is why in the end I wrote that book that you very kindly showed, because the study that's reported in a manuscript must be able to address the question or the aim of the manuscript. And that's where rejection comes in. If the data that are presented actually aren't valuable because they don't address the aim. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Here we are. So here's an example of the aims and scope. Publishing houses control the websites for journals. They're not always good looking. Ours certainly isn't. And I'm regularly in contact with the publisher trying to improve it. But all journals will have somewhere on their website a statement of the aims and scope. And that's where you can find out your initial information on whether your work, your manuscript might fit a journal. So for IJP, for example, we disseminate research, current research in fundamental primatology. So fundamental primatology is not applied primatology. That's the distinction we're making. And the distinction mainly there is that we don't publish biomedical primatology. We do publish on conservation, because conservation is both fundamental. Obviously, without conservation, there'd be no primates. And we also publish a whole range of anthropology, anatomy, ecology, ethology, paleo, psychology, sociology, zoology articles seeking to understand or further our understand of primates, both lab and field studies, and obviously increasingly combined lab and field studies. So that's the sort of statement, if you're looking at journals, that you'll find on their website, which will help you to understand whether your study might fit in. The other thing that helps you to understand is what is already published in that journal. So have a look at the tables of contents. Again, those are all available on the websites. So what else do editors look in for in a manuscript? Very much a secondary concern is the presentation. So that is whether the material is in the right place, in the right section, the quality of the writing, the clarity, even things like typos and the care with which you put the manuscript together. Those are secondary concerns, but they're things that we can work on. So those are not the primary decision points that an editor will use. And then I mentioned this already, and if I repeat myself, it's because I'm just recovering from COVID and my brain is only half with me. So a couple of myths, and there are many myths about scientific publication. One is that journals don't like replication. We do. Replication is fine up to a point. So maybe not the 100th study of exactly the same thing, but a study testing whether we can generalize from another study is fine. And non-significant results are welcome. So you don't have to have that P is less than 0.05, with the caveat that the study design must be appropriate for the test. So if your results are non-significant because the sample size is so small that it couldn't be anything else, then that is a problem. But if your sample size is appropriate and your results are non-significant, that's a finding, it's important. So here, this is a reminder that your manuscript is this section here at the bottom. I don't know if you can see my mouse, the bottom of the slide where it says present findings in green. So I've just laid out the scientific process, beginning with a research question, moving on to hypotheses and predictions, so your ideas, then a study that you design to address those questions. You collect data, you analyze the data, you interpret your findings, you discuss them with other people, you put them into the context of what we already knew. And then presenting the findings is the very last part, and that's the manuscript. So whether the manuscript is good enough really depends on the rest of the process. So it's really the last part. So in many cases, when we have to reject a manuscript, it's because something went wrong very early in this process. So when I mentioned choosing a journal, I've got the aims and scope of the International Journal of Primatology here as an example. Another thing you can think about is where a similar recent article is published. So not articles from a long time ago, but maybe from the last 5 or 10 years. If the articles you've been reading, to put your study into context, where are they published? Because that will give you a good idea of where the people that you want to read your work are publishing their work. So looking down your own reference list can be useful. If you discover that you're citing work in one particular journal a lot, then you might want to look at that journal. And then you look at the aims and scope to be sure. And this is something as well that you can discuss with co-authors, discuss with colleagues, but do beware of those myths. So people will tell you things about journals that aren't necessarily true or might be out of date. So I find it interesting at conferences, people don't always know who I am, of course. And so people will tell me things about IJP. So for example, I've been told that IJP doesn't like social science, which is absolutely not true. We do publish social science. So if you have a question about the aim and scope of a journal, ask the editor rather than someone else. One thing that people often use is an impact factor. The impact factors are widely used, very problematic, because they're often used to assess a researcher or a manuscript rather than a journal. So journal impact factors measure something to do with the journal, and it's to do with the citations of work in the last 2 years in that journal. Although they often are used to compare across fields, you can't use them to compare across fields. So if somebody asks you to do that, or you see people doing that, remind them that you can't, because different fields have different citation practices, and they move at, and crucially, they move at different speeds. So a field like research into COVID, which moves very fast, will work at a very different speed to primatology, where it can take us a couple of years to get data, and then we've got analysis and writing on top of that. And the other problem with journal impact factors is that the data that are used to put them together are not openly available, so we can't check them. And people who have tried to reproduce journal impact factors have found that they can't. So I don't use them. I haven't told you the impact factor of the International Journal of Primatology. I'm not going to, because to me, it's not a useful metric. It's certainly not a useful way of judging the value of an individual paper. The only way of judging the value of an individual paper is to read it. So I'll get on now to the process. So I'm going to walk you through this chart here. And the first part is the part that you, I think, are all at the moment with the manuscript for this workshop. And that is you write your manuscript. And you check the aims and scope of the journal, or the journals that you might think of submitting it to. Check other articles in that journal and see whether yours fits in, if it's similar in terms of approach, in terms of the sample size and so on. Follow the instructions once you've chosen a journal. So journals all have instructions. They overlap, but they're each different. And then the better you follow the instructions, the better your manuscript will be. Write clearly, accurately, and concisely. And I recognize that is more difficult if you are not, don't speak English as or write English as your first language. Get feedback, get other people to read your work, even if you think that's introducing a delay. That sort of feedback is extremely useful, because when you're writing your own work, you don't have the cognitive distance from it to be able to assess it. Somebody else will be able to point out logical problems that you can't see. So once you've prepared your manuscript, then you can submit it. And again, follow the instructions. Each journal has a slightly different online system, which is frustrating. Wouldn't it be nice if they were all the same? But there will be instructions on the system, and there will be an email to ask if you have any problems. There are occasionally issues. These systems are largely designed in North America, and so they're designed around people, for example, who have 1 or 2 first names and then 1 family name, which isn't the case across the world. For example, in large parts of South America, most people have 2 first names and 2 family names. Other parts of the world, people might have 1 name, and there are loads of other different naming systems. So I badger my publisher quite a lot about this, but so far I haven't got anywhere. So follow the instructions. When you're going through submitting your manuscript, you're allowed to suggest referees. So those are the people who are going to assess your manuscript. You're often invited to do this. It's usually an option. In some journals, it's an obligation. You have to do this, but it's worth doing. And it's worth doing because editors are busy people and they like to get that advice. What they're looking for are people who will be able to assess your work but didn't contribute to it. So you can't suggest your co-authors, and you can't suggest somebody who helped you. You can't suggest somebody from your PhD committee, if that's how your PhD system works, or your PhD supervisor. It's somebody who's independent of your work, but you think would be able to comment on it and would be interested in commenting on it. And then you usually can explain why you're doing that. It isn't usually a list of other primatologists that you know. That can be very tempting, and I've seen it happen, particularly for people who, for one reason or another, don't know many international primatologists. So you might be just starting out as a student, you might be in a small cohort, you might come from a country where primatology is not a major discipline. But that isn't really what they're looking for. They're looking for authors of similar articles and experts on your question and species. They don't have to be primatologists. They could be somebody who works on a similar question, but in a different species. In some cases, we look at how primates interact with other species, like plants, and you might even choose a botanist. So that's worth doing, and explain why. You can also block reviewers, and this is if you know that there is somebody who has a conflict of interest with you, and they're not going to be able to give a balanced opinion of your manuscript, or if you're worried because you know that they are unethical. For example, we hear a lot about this. I don't think it happens very much, but it does happen. I'm going to get onto plagiarism later, but people do block work, they do copy work. So if you know that there's someone in your field who has a problem, then you can block them. Again, you need to explain why, and that can be awkward, because sometimes we have a suspicion, but we can't, we have no evidence. So blocking reviewers is something that I don't encourage unless it's absolutely essential. Sometimes you have two field teams or teams from different places who are working on a very similar question and competing. I would much rather that they work together, because the more people work together, the better the science in the end. But I understand that people compete, and you might block a competing team. But if you do that, always give reasons. So here is one example of an online system. This is ours. It's called Editorial Manager, and it just goes through a whole process of steps, many more steps than you would expect, and it takes longer than you would expect. It asks you all sorts of questions, but in the end, you get an opportunity to review what you submitted, check it all looks right, and submit it to the journal, breathe a sigh of relief, and go off and have a cup of tea, or take the rest of the day off, whatever you're doing. Once you have submitted your article to the journal, it goes to the editor. It doesn't go to the editor straight away, because there's usually somebody in between who checks basic quality, but it will get to the editor within a few days. And the editor then reads it and decides whether they can send it for review. So at IJP, we usually do send for review, but that first initial screening is important to pick up major problems. And I suppose an obvious one would be if the article's not on primates, then I won't send it for review. It doesn't happen very often, but just on occasion it does. So the editor might use an editorial board or associate editors. The role of editorial boards and associate editors varies from journal to journal. You can always find their information on the website again. So I won't give you the specifics of how it works at IJP, because it works in very different ways. In some cases, editorial boards are essentially reviewers. In other cases, they might act more like an editor and they control the review process. But somewhere in the system is an editor who reads your manuscript and gives it that first initial screening. As long as you pass that initial screening, and again, at IJP, almost all of the manuscripts we get do, it goes for peer review. So there are usually 2 or 3 reviewers. To get those two or three reviewers, the editor will invite initially 2 or 3 people, and then go through a process of inviting further people until they've secured 2 or 3 reviewers who are prepared to assess the manuscript in the next few weeks. And we choose reviewers that we think will be able to give a useful assessment of the manuscript, and that's usually something like an expert in the question in the manuscript, regardless of the species, so it doesn't have to be on the same species, same question, similar question. An expert in the topic or method, particularly if it's a laboratory method. And then perhaps a taxon-specific expert. So, for example, if we're thinking about gibbons, then you might have a taxon-specific expert because some of the details in the manuscript will relate only to gibbons, and therefore we need that assessment. But it won't only be gibbon people, mandrill people, if the manuscript's on mandrills, I study mandrills. It will be, we choose reviewers across a variety to get a good overall assessment of the manuscript. We might also invite an expert statistical reviewer, or we might do that later in the process if we discover that there might be questions about the statistics. And that's because, as you all know, I'm sure, statistics become rapidly very complicated. So normally the manuscript goes out to 2 or 3 reviewers. They read the manuscript and they are given instructions to read it critically, but constructively, and they write a report. And that report initially comes to the editor, and it includes comments that only go to the editor on occasion. But the large part of that report is written to the authors, and it's about the manuscript. So after a while, the editor receives all of those reviewer reports, 2 or 3. That can take longer than you might expect because it takes a while to recruit reviewers. Everybody is busy. And there are times of year when no one's available, like the summer, everybody's off doing other things, our summer. So the editor reads the report and then rereads the manuscript with those reports in mind and writes their own report, which can be briefer. It might be a summary of what the reviewers have found, but the editor often has their own comments. And at that point, the editor takes a decision about the manuscript. And so your decisions are shown here on the left of my slide. They are basically reject, revise, or accept. Now I'm going to go through from the most negative to the positive. So let's start with reasons to reject. So the editor takes a decision. And why would we reject? I've got this in the wrong order. What happens if you get a rejection? Apologies. The first thing to do when you get a rejection, I think, probably is to turn your computer off and go for a walk. Then come back and read the comments carefully to understand what happened. And think about the reasons for rejection. So your initial reaction, depending on who you are, might be, well, it will be disappointment. You might be angry, you might be sad. There's a lot of emotional investment in the manuscript. So initially you need to deal with your emotions and then start to think about, well, what are the comments? Is there anything I can learn from this, both for this manuscript and for future work? If I can address some of the comments, I might be able to revise my manuscript and send it elsewhere. Sometimes the editor will suggest where you might choose to send it. Don't just reformat your manuscript and submit it elsewhere, because primatology is quite a small world. It's likely to, in the end, go to the same reviewers again, and reviewers get very cross if even the most minor comments haven't yet been addressed when they are easy to address. So do revise the manuscript as much as you can. Sometimes, if it's a decision of reject, then there will be things you can't fix. But that's okay, because there are plenty of journals out there. Always acknowledge the reviewers and editors, even if you're sending your manuscript elsewhere. If somebody has taken the time to report on your manuscript and give you feedback, then it's worth acknowledging that work. So I said I would give you reasons to reject. These are basically, if the topic is inappropriate, So the easy one there for a primatology journal is if it's actually on a different taxon, it's not on primates. If the methods are unsound and can't be fixed, so this is if there's something wrong with the methods that introduces a bias, that means that the data don't tell us anything. So think back to the slide when I said actually that most of the problems with studies are about study design. This goes back well before writing a paper. This is where the methods suffer from a major flaw that the reviewers have identified that you may not have known about, sadly, but there's nothing you can do about it at this point. If I can, with the reviewers, find a way to fix those methods, then I will suggest it. I might still reject the manuscript, but allow for resubmission if you can fix the problem. So again, this is the issue that we try to be constructive, we try to find something that will work. Sometimes people have data and they've used it to address a question that they cannot address, but the data is still useful, in which case I or the reviewers together, we will suggest what you might do with those data instead. Sometimes we detect ethical concerns. In primatology, that might be that the study contravenes our guidelines. It might be that there is no permit or no information about permits to conduct the work. And without that, then we can't publish it. It might be that you have shipped samples across international borders and there's no information about the permission to ship samples. That sort of thing you can fix. And if you can fix it, right back to the editor and say, oh my goodness, to the editor and say, well, we do have the permits, here's the information. But if you don't, then the work may not be publishable at all. And then we reject for publication misconduct, and I'm going to cover that towards the end when I've finished with the process. More positively than reject, you will be asked for revisions. So in many years now of editing the International Journal of Primatology, I don't think I've ever accepted a manuscript straight away with no revisions at all. Sometimes the revisions are very small, they're typos, but there's always something. So the vast majority of manuscripts get to this point where the editor asks for revisions. And when you are asked for revisions, those might be minor revisions, they might be major revisions. They can also be revise and resubmit. So minor revisions are revisions to the writing. So it might be that some of the material is in the wrong place. Very often you find methods in the results, for example, or discussion in the results, or results in the discussion. So there are things that can be fixed by rewriting the manuscript. Major revisions are where you need to reanalyze some of the data, add additional analysis. Usually, journals vary with this. You also have this option of reject and with an invitation to resubmit. At IJP, we use that where it's not possible to evaluate the quality of the manuscript because there's too much missing information, and that's usually information missing from the methods, so we can't assess the methods. So the methods are not detailed enough. And we use reject and resubmit at that point because we haven't been able to assess the methods, but we think it's worth looking. So we ask for more details to the methods and start the process again. Some journals now use an invitation to resubmit instead of revisions. That's for, essentially it's playing with journal metrics. It is to reduce the apparent time it takes for a journal to take a decision, because it means that they reject all the manuscripts and then receive them again when they're almost perfect and accept them quickly. So their time to decision looks really good, but actually the process isn't any different. It also, of course, means they get to reject lots of manuscripts. So for journals that like to publish the fact that they're highly selective, it's very, very useful to reject lots of manuscripts. That sort of thing doesn't interest me. I'm interested in the science. So when you get comments, again, it's the same thing as when you get a rejection, except that at least you've got a hope of publishing this manuscript in this journal. The comments will be painful. I've seen people react even to comments about typos. Comments are always painful because you thought your manuscript was perfect when you sent it off. So again, you need to breathe read the comments carefully, take them constructively. So it's very easy to be cross and defensive about the comments you receive, but if the process is working, they should all be constructive. Sometimes reviewers are not constructive, probably because they're busy, sometimes because they're not particularly helpful people. But the comments themselves will be helpful. Even if you need to pull the help out of them, if a reviewer can't understand something you've written, even if you think it's well explained, that means that some readers can't understand it. So it is worth revising it for clarity. If they don't think the method that you've chosen is appropriate, it might be a simple case of justifying why you chose it and why you think it is appropriate, but it's always useful to have those critical comments because in the end, addressing them improves the manuscript. Doesn't always feel like it, but it does. Talk to your co-authors and colleagues about the comments as well. Sharing them, particularly when they're painful, is always useful. And here we have, apologies, this isn't coming up one by one as I'd hoped. Reasons why we asked for revisions. Insufficient context. So this is usually in the introduction, sometimes also in the discussion. And this is where a manuscript focuses entirely on the study and the species that you studied. And a very obvious example that I come across a lot is when the manuscript opens with a description of the study species, rather than the general scientific question that you wanted to address, followed by the study species that you chose to address it in. So all of the questions we look at, I think without exception, are more general than they are than the particular study species. And yet, of course, because we're interested in the study species very often, we forget to review the literature that is broader than our study species. We also forget in the discussion to look at what we know about this question in other species and put the information we now have and the data we now have into context. So that's a revision. It will mean a lot more reading and reviewing of the literature and comparing what you found with other studies. That's probably the most common reason we ask for revisions. Linked to that perhaps is that the aims are unclear. So the author usually knows why they did a study, but they don't always manage to explain it and convey it in their manuscript. So sometimes even when you've read the whole manuscript, it's quite unclear why this person did the study. I've mentioned already that methods are not sufficiently detailed. So the idea of a method section is that somebody else would be able to replicate your study. And without sufficient detail, they can't do that. So that's very common. So for example, you might say that you collected behavioral data, but if you didn't say exactly which methods you used to collect behavioral data, then somebody else wouldn't collect the same data. Inappropriate analyses, but good data. So where the data look like they're probably fine, but the statistical analyses are inappropriate, then that's a reason to request major revisions. Sometimes the results are not sufficiently described. The main thing here, I think, is where you might have the results of inferential statistical analysis, but not actually show the data. So you don't actually know what the effect looks like. Sometimes the conclusions are not supported by the data. And I think this happens because people have a very strong idea of what they thought they were going to find. And even if they don't find it, they still discuss what they thought they would find. And then more minor things, the writing might become repetitive and material is in the wrong place. So I mentioned that very often you find extra methods written in the results or the discussion in the results. And this comes from the fact that the structure of a scientific paper, which I will comment on very briefly later on if I have time, it doesn't reflect the way we think. So very often we put our thoughts in the wrong place and the wrong part of a manuscript, and that's where getting help from other people can be very useful. So once you've got the comments and this request for a revision, when you're revising your manuscript, again, follow instructions. I'm a big fan of instructions. Write a detailed response. So copy out the comments and explain how you addressed each one, and explain in a way that's helpful to the reader. And this is really important because editors and reviewers, again, are busy people. So the more helpful you are, the better off you are. Be polite, even if you don't feel like thanking the editor and reviewers, even if you still think that they were wrong, always be polite. Explain the changes you made. If you choose not to follow a suggestion, explain why you didn't do it, but don't just do that for all of the comments. So don't simply take all of the comments and say why you didn't address them, because that won't help anybody. And acknowledge the reviewers, because they put in a lot of work and they get very little reward. It's all done behind the scenes. So acknowledge them. You don't know who they are, but you can say in your acknowledgements that the manuscript benefited from peer review. And once you've done that, it goes back to the editor. And you can expect this to happen more than once. So you'll probably get at least 2 rounds of revisions on a manuscript. And I think that's probably quite unexpected in many cases, that it happens more than once. And then it goes through the same thing. At this point, you may or may not go for peer review. It depends on whether the editor themselves can assess the revisions. And then the most positive outcome is when you finally get your manuscript accepted, after which it goes to the publisher for production and you can celebrate. And you get forms, these are done on the internet, to complete. So you'll have several emails giving information. You might be given the opportunity to provide a cover image, in which case you can provide an image of your study species, your study site. You must check your proofs carefully and send them back. So that's when you're sent a version of the article as it will appear in print, and you need to check it very carefully. Get someone else to check it if you can too, for errors. Ask the production editor if you have any queries. And then finally send it out to people and celebrate, because you're finally at the end of that process with that article. Now, I'm aware that I have just a few minutes left, and so I think we'll cover ethics and then maybe stop there. And if there's something that you'd like to ask me about, please do. So I mentioned research misconduct earlier, and there are 3 forms. One is fabrication, which is simply making up data. Another is falsification, and that is so not making up data, but selecting data. So the research is not reported accurately. And these are major issues, and if we detect them, then you can get in quite a lot of trouble, and there's definitely reasons for rejection. And then the one I want to talk about a little bit further is plagiarism, and that's because it is a problem it's a problem for anyone writing in science, but it can be a particular problem for people who are not writing in their own first language. And plagiarism is when you appropriate another person's work and present it as though it's your own. So that includes copying ideas, phrases, and sentences from published and unpublished material. And that's even if you put a citation in there. So if you cite the material, but you're still using the words of the person that you copied it from, still plagiarism. It includes taking, and I'm not suggesting anyone in the room would do this, but I have seen it happen in primatology, stealing ideas from conferences, stealing ideas from grant proposals that you've had the privilege of seeing, stealing ideas from papers that you've had the privilege of reviewing. So this is uncommon, but it does happen. It also includes if you alter a few words in a sentence or change the order of phrases. And journals, I think pretty much across the board now, have software to pick up on plagiarism. So the editor gets a report that says how much of the paper is the same as published work or work on the internet. So as I say, it can be a deliberate attempt to steal ideas. So I don't think that is the problem that we might be addressing today. I think what's more important is that it can come from a lack of confidence in your own writing. And that can happen to anybody. We get a lot of plagiarism in undergraduates in the UK, but it can happen particularly if English is not your first language, because it's very tempting if somebody's written something in beautiful English, then to copy it rather than trying to understand it and put it into your own words, particularly if you're always being told that your English needs to be improved. But the important thing here is always use your own words and always credit the original author and practice rephrasing. The more you read in English, the better the phrases will come to mind. And another major thing that I see a lot is when you read and take notes, always make sure that you're not copying notes from articles you're reading, because if you copy a phrase or a sentence from an article into your notes, and then months later you come back to your notes, you might think you wrote it and use it in your writing. But actually you copied it from someone else. And that's a really common way of phrases appearing, looking like it's plagiarized when it's completely unintentional. So always take notes in your own words. And that's really helpful for your understanding too, because if you take notes in someone else's words, you might not understand. Take notes in your own words and you have to understand. What happens if we do detect misconduct? Again, I'm sure I'm sure nobody in this room would set out to commit misconduct, but this is so you know what happens when you read a retraction. If editors find evidence of misconduct in a published article, it's too late to not publish it, then they retract it to correct the literature. And you'll sometimes see retracted work. And that's when there's a notice permanently linked to the article saying that it should not have been published and explaining why. So I will skip over this bit, I think. I'm sorry for having prepared a talk that was longer than I thought. But I will send you my slides. So here we are. I wanted just to very quickly cover some questions that came up in the terms of reference, and which I have heard before as well. So does having well-known researchers as co-authors affect acceptance? No, it doesn't, because manuscripts are based on the work, are assessed based on the work, not on the reputation of the person. There is no point, unfortunately for me, to put my name on your paper in the hope that that will help. First of all, nobody, perhaps with a very few exceptions, has a reputation that is so good that they will be recognized by all editors. And mainly because manuscripts are assessed based on the work reported in the manuscript. So it doesn't matter how good the person you put on paper is, it won't affect, or it shouldn't affect whether it's accepted. And in many journals now address this point by using double-blind reviewing, and that is where the reviewers don't know who an author is on the paper, just as the authors don't know who the reviewers are. There is such a thing as triple-blind reviewing, and that is where the editor is also blind to the author's identities. We don't use that at the moment because I haven't managed to figure out a way to get it to work. So I do my best to ignore the identity of the authors. And some comments on English. This is really to admit that we do have an international problem, the fact that we rely on one imperial language to write science. English has become the language of science, which puts barriers in the way of those who don't use English. There are a few tiny efforts to address, so International Journal of Primatology, for example, we publish abstracts in other languages. So if you submit your manuscript in English, then you can translate the abstract into as many languages as you like. And journals that publish in other languages, for example, if you publish in Indonesian, you can translate the abstract into English. It's not an answer, or it's not a solution, but it does at least mean that your work is slightly more findable if it's published in that, if the abstract is in multiple languages. If I come across an abstract of a study in another language, in English, but the study is in another language, and the abstract interests me, then I might find a way of reading the article. If there's no access to that translation of the title and abstract, then I wouldn't even know it existed. And this is easy for me to say because I don't use translation services, but non-expert translation services often translate work into very poor scientific language. And I've come across this a lot. And it's actually more difficult, I think, to edit that sort of paper than it is to edit one that has been written by a primatologist whose English is not very good. And I think I had just a couple of points. It seems I had a lot to say, but I think this is the last point I will make. There was a comment in terms of reference about article processing charges. And so again, I had some comments on this, no solutions, I'm afraid. But I think we all know that article processing charges for journals that charge them are huge. There are positive reasons behind open access, but they are very biased towards some countries. It's always worth looking for publishers' waivers and discounts. Publishers will tell you that these are the answer to the problem of article processing charges and the fact that some people in some countries, many people in many countries, can't afford to pay them. There may be waivers that apply to you, it's worth looking, but they are never sufficient and they don't apply to many countries of people. You can choose pay-to-read journals rather than pay-to-publish journals, so they still exist. Many journals are hybrid, IJP is hybrid. It's not an ideal solution because we know that papers that are published behind a paywall are less likely to be read, but it is a way to publish work. The way to get around pay-to-read is to share your article. So when it's published, you as the author can send it to whomever you like. So share it. You get a link to send it. You can. There are shareable links you can use in social media. You can send the PDF to named people. You can self-archive. Look into the rules on that, but it is possible to either share the manuscript rather than the published paper, or to, after a while, to share the published paper. You can make it very obvious to people on your website, for example, that you will share work if people ask for it. So again, these are workarounds, they're not an answer, but they're workarounds. And please keep pointing the problem out, because we just need to keep talking and talking and talking about it. Publishers can afford to give many more waivers than they do. They won't because they're businesses, but we just need to keep pointing it out. So here's my final quote. And this is a reminder that we don't start out writing well. Nobody, even the authors you respect the most, started by writing well. They all start out by writing badly, thinking it's good, and then gradually learning and getting better at it. So don't give up, even when things are difficult and you've had a rejection or you've been sent revisions. Keep writing. So thank you very much for your attention, and I will happily answer questions.
Thank you very much, Jo, for joining us even at the end of COVID. It's greatly appreciated. That's brilliant, so interesting. Thank you. I'm actually going to ask one question that has come up in discussions. Can you quote someone? And how do you do it? Because that's using someone's words. So how can you give a quote in a paper without it being plagiarism?
Yeah, so that is a great question. So I'm going to assume that that's quoting work in the introduction or the discussion. Mainly in science, we don't. Very occasionally we will, in which case you put it in clear quotation marks with the citation, but really it's limited to, well, the dead white men, really. We might quote Darwin, but you wouldn't quote me, or I think almost anybody alive today. So we don't do it, because in science it's very rarely the words that matter, it's the idea that matters. I suppose there might be the odd case where you wanted to critique a hypothesis and you needed to quote it all as it's written to say that there are difficulties with it. But it's very rare. So the answer is you put it in quotation marks and then cite the author. So it's very obvious it's not your work, but it would never be more than a couple of sentences, and it's very rare that you need to do it.
Thank you. So, ada pertanyaan untuk Joe? Kalau mau bahasa Inggris, langsung aja. Kalau bahasa Indonesia, we can translate. Silakan saja. I think you were obviously very, very clear, Joe. There are no questions. No. Okay. Oh, yes, Ada.
Okay. Hi, Joe. Okay, Leila, I'm going to ask the topic which you mentioned. It is about the reasons to reject a publication. So you mentioned about the unsound methods which complicates. I'm still a bit unclear, and sometimes I am also worried that my manuscript also included in the unsound methods. So can you give me an example? A publication which you used in unsound methods that you have previously rejected. Thank you.
I'm going to repeat the question just to be sure I got it right. It's about unsound methods. And can I give an example? So I'll use an example of census methods that don't work. So I'm doing this a bit blind. I don't know how familiar you are with census methods, but if you are in two very different habitats, so if you're in one habitat where you can easily see, and you're in another habitat where there's lots of low growth and low vegetation, it's very difficult to see. If you just walk transects in those two different habitats and count the number of primates that you see, your methods will be so biased that you can't compare the two habitats, because you, in some case, in one place you can see a long way, so you see more animals, and in another place, the other place you can't see very far, so you wouldn't see very many animals. So you haven't got a good estimate of the number of animals in each habitat. So that would be one example. Actually, the more I talk, the more I can think of. Another example would be, this is very common in primatology, to compare one group of animals in one sort of habitat with another group in another habitat, and try to draw conclusions about habitat, when in fact all you know is that the groups is whether the groups are different or similar, but because you've only got one group in each habitat, you can't determine whether it's an effect of group or an effect of habitat.
So would that mean then that some of it can come down to sample size?
Yes, yeah, basically, and understanding what your replicates are. So yeah, it's biases in the methods. Validation as well, often. So one classic example is people use hormone assays on feces without checking whether they actually work for that species. That's really common.
Thank you. Adelaide? Yes.
Hey, Jill, I want to ask about how long you average time to publish in HTTP? I mean, from submit until publish.
So sorry, I didn't, there's an echo in the room, I didn't hear everything. How long does it take to publish, is that right?
Yes, so from submission to publication, yeah. We had a lot more technical problems yesterday with Windows, so this is the good version. So yeah, time to publish from when you press submit.
Right. I would need to look up the actual data. So the ideal process is that you submit and then the reviews take about a month. In fact, in practice, they probably take 2 months. So that would be from your submission to getting the reviews would be probably 2 months, sometimes longer. It depends how long it takes the reviewers to do their work and the editors to do their work. Then the bit that I can't control as editor is how long it takes you to do the revisions. So if you're quick, that shortens the time. If you're slow, then it can take a long time. Then there's more revisions. So I'm guessing maybe 6 months, but it really varies a lot. So if everything works quickly, then the slowest part is the peer review. But what we find actually is often the slowest part is the authors, because authors always have other things to do. So if you get your decision letter and you're just about to go into the lab for a period of extended lab work, or to the field for extended field work, then that can take a long time. So the decision would take a couple of months. And that's the first time round. If it needs more review, that would take the same length of time again. It's much quicker once you're getting just to communication between the author and the editor. But if you're interested in the exact statistics, they're probably on our website, because publishers like to publish that sort of thing.
Thank you, that's quite useful. I didn't realise time to publish was on websites. Have we got any further questions? If not, oh yes, one more.
Kalau misalkan saya sudah punya pertanyaan tentang ada single author atau itu namanya yang tidak apakah single bau atau itu yang sudah ada yang pernah dipakai model.
Question about I think it's a style when you're publishing the formatting. I think you said that IJP has a lot of examples, templates of how to prepare the manuscript. I think I can guess what you're going to say, but always check the current guidelines for authors. Do not compare previously published work.
Yeah, so what we do have is a lot of instructions, and the instructions are lengthy, but I hope they're useful. We don't have templates, and I have wondered about that. Maybe it's something I do need to think about. Similarly, I've thought about structured abstract. I don't know if you've seen structured abstract, where because we ask authors to summarize the introduction, the methods, results, conclusions in their abstract, but very often they muddle those up. And I have thought about saying, look, I'm going to have separate sections of the abstract to do this. So maybe templates would be a good idea. I'm always a fan of guidelines and instructions, but I'm very well aware that other people would much rather have examples than so, yeah, my advice would be to look at the instructions and then look at recent articles if you want examples. So articles from the last couple of years.
Right, it's the articles from the last
couple of years. Is that what you said? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, on the current guidelines.
Well, I'm just trying to work out what time it is in the UK, but it's 3 o'clock here. 9 o'clock for you?
It is, yeah. The working days
Yeah.
just start.
Okay. Well, I think again, thank you for getting up to join us at what must have been 8 o'clock. And I think the information has been incredibly helpful and useful. And it helps, reinforce a lot of the information we've had from other speakers. And it's really helpful to have, we've had a national journal editor, we've had a regional journal editor, and now an international journal editor. So I hope it has been very useful. Terima kasih banyak, Joe. Hopefully see you soon. Get well soon. Yeah, thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your workshop. Yeah, so.